So it's always hard to identify one single moment in time when I first started to worry about bioethics or be curious about bioethics. I think for PRIM&R's purposes and for what we're talking about, and so that I don't put you to sleep with a long and labored story, um, I think it'd be best to just give you a sort of truncated story about the bioethics piece and then think a little bit or talk a little bit about the research ethics piece. And bioethics grew from the time I was in high school, growing up in New Jersey, working as an EMT, same state that Karen Ann Quinlan lived in, and figuring out that those questions were actually harder than some of the medical questions. When I was an undergraduate at Duke, I wanted to write my own major in bioethics. And I was advised by all my professors at the time that bioethics was a flash in the pan, it was going to go away, it wasn't going to be anything, and that I really should just do something solid. And so whenever I give advice to students at Hopkins today, I remember that advice I received and realized I'm doling out information that may or may not be helpful. That said, I organized a conference when I was an undergraduate, raising $10,000 to bring in the world's experts, and was amazed at the interest from the community, and also how dull people could make this fascinating topic. And I just didn't want it to be dull. It couldn't be that dull. And I persisted in my interest in bioethics through medical school, where they had thought that my interest in bioethics was only to get into medical school. And when I was a resident and I said I wanted to do bioethics, they thought it was because I wanted to get a good residency. And all those things were true, but I really wanted to do bioethics. So after finishing my residency at Duke, I went to Hopkins as a fellow in general internal medicine, where they actually believed me that I wanted to do bioethics and asked me what it would take. And the field was still relatively young, and I thought that I needed a degree in philosophy so that I could look at some of the conceptual questions, and a degree in public health so I could look at the empirical questions. And I wasn't sure how all of that was going to fit together. But I did a fellowship and got 2 masters at the same time, and didn't do much else those few years, but it was a really good background to be able to do good work. And then I went back to Duke to start a program in medical ethics. And it was the only place that I would probably have gone back to, because I knew how difficult it was going to be, but I knew the players and I knew the place. And that was really exciting. As a baby professor going out and trying to teach the people with who trained me about ethics was fascinating and an important set of struggles, but also received extraordinarily well. Most of what I was focusing on that time were the kinds of issues that most doctors face. So end-of-life decision-making, living wills, advance directives, questions that arose at the bedside. And then, as you may remember, sometime during 1994, there were revelations that the US government had conducted over 4,000 human radiation experiments, none of which were done with consent. I kind of liked consent, and I was pretty horrified by what I was hearing, and didn't think too much more about it until a series of phone calls came. And the short answer was that I was invited to serve as a senior policy and research analyst for the White House Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. And I commuted between Duke, Durham, and Washington, D.C. I spent a night a week for 18 months there, or sometimes more, and tried to unpack, at President Clinton's request, what the history is of these radiation experiments, and then to try to assure the American people, in the words of his initial executive order, that these things couldn't happen again. And what amazed me through the historical look was these were practicing doctors and scientists at the best institutions across our country, and they were doing stuff that just didn't seem right. And I couldn't imagine how it had happened. But they weren't necessarily thinking themselves as unethical. They didn't do consent because consent wasn't that much a part of medicine as much. And as scary as those experiments sounded, they had gone to great efforts to ensure that the risk was minimized. And that was the ethic of the time. But the most exciting part of my job was to inform the Commission's policy recommendations to the President moving forward. And we got to conduct a series of empirical projects. One is we looked at federal agency policies. That's not great. You're a lawyer. You know how exciting that work can be. And sometimes people prepare those together and call them briefs, but they're never brief. And then there was there was an oral history project that was involved. There was a research proposal review project in which we reviewed 125 research proposals from institutions around the country and found flaws in how that research was actually being reviewed by IRBs and how the work could be done better. And then my baby was a thing called the subject interview study. And the subject interview study was a nationwide study to understand what people's attitudes and beliefs were with respect to research in the United States. And there were an amazing number of findings in that study, but perhaps one of the most interesting ones related to an observation that we made along the way. We were the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, and yet researchers at Duke and Hopkins and other great institutions around the country were announcing cure for cancer. And I didn't think much of it, except they were on the same pages of the best papers in the country. And I got to a university one day on a visit to meet with different groups around the country who were ordered by President Clinton to desist destruction of any Cold War radiation research records so that this investigation could take place. And I got to a certain university, and a woman who was on the committee, and I think she was a bank president in town, and they'd been deliberating for a couple of months about what their university had done, hadn't done. And she said, well, you know, Dr. Sugarman, thanks so much for coming from the White House today. I said, well, thank you. And she said, you know, at the University of blank, we did research and no experiments. Now, I had been waiting for a long time to ask a dean a really hard question, and I said, sir, at the University of blank, what's the difference between research and an experiment? And he said, well, you could force me to come up with a definition, but they're basically the same. I said, ma'am, could you make them a little smarter, educate them a bit? She said, you absolutely know the difference. Research is cutting edge. It's what you want if you're sick. And experiments when you're testing something out. And this wasn't a person being asked to be in a research study. This isn't someone who hadn't thought about the issues. This was an articulate, smart, engaged, powerful person who had a very different understanding of the enterprise that they were talking about. So in conjunction with others, I spent your tax dollars and some of mine on a project where we went around the country and talked to 1,882 people at 5 different cities across the country. And one of the things we asked them was to distinguish different terms used to describe research. Medical research, medical experiment, clinical trial, and clinical investigation. We asked them if they thought they differed, where they faced greater risks, and where they were better off, and things like that. It was stunning. Just like the bank president said, most people thought that experiments were risky, scary, and medical study was the complete reverse. It was better than research, if you will, which I didn't understand until we did in-depth interviews. In in-depth interviews, many people understood a study as the doctors and nurses are studying up on you and your disease. They get your medical records. That's not a phase 1 study. Those data were so interesting, and they informed the committee's policy recommendations to the president about the status of consent procedures and what people understand, but also got me jazzed about the question about informed consent. And if we just didn't explain to people what this research enterprise was about, the basic assumption, there's no way that quibbling over things like a consent form or the like would matter. Okay, so march forward, I am now so interested in research ethics, both the perspectives of what happened historically and what was happening currently, and I saw a research avenue ahead to try to improve or change what happens through data, the way that doctors and nurses and researchers learn. About the same time, I was invited to join the IRB of Family Health International, which was doing research around the globe on things mostly at the time of women's health issue and reproductive health, which merged very soon after into some of the most cutting-edge HIV-related research around the globe. And working on that side of things opened up a lens on the world and its troubles in a way that I hadn't seen before. And so the research ethics piece stuck. So that's the beginning. The important point is that people don't necessarily share the same denotative and connotative meanings of terms used to describe research. And I don't know how they differ locally, but I have to find out. And I think it's incumbent on investigators and IRBs and people charged with oversight to sort through that, to make sure that people that they're asking to enroll in research understand the terms, or at least the concept. What we learned is the term itself doesn't matter as much as the understanding piece. And so if that's the long-term lesson from that there's going to be a need to inquire, and things are going to change over time. Those data are old. I don't know if they still apply, but I'd have to ask that question each time, or at periodic intervals, to find out. So the subject interview study was precisely that. It was the voices of 1,882 people who were likely to be enrolled in research. And I don't remember the precise numbers, but I'm thinking about 60% of the people had some research experience. I could be wrong on that. Easy enough to find. We purposefully sampled radiation oncology, medical oncology, and cardiology waiting rooms. So at institutions that we suspected doing research, because we were asking this research question. So we went there for that. And many people were positive about research, but some people were negative, and their willingness to participate moved in different ways. Another piece of that study was in-depth interviews that we did with about 100 people in the study, which provided another rich data set about their experiences. So I encountered IRBs for the first time as an investigator when I was a fellow at Hopkins. And I was disappointed with the process as an investigator. The IRB at Hopkins at the time was bureaucratic, as many of them were. It was a big IRB, and we were trying to do a survey study. Ruth Vaden and I were trying to do a survey study of professional healthcare workers' attitudes towards treating patients with multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis, which was emerging at the time. And we wanted to know what the ethical obligations of people to care in those settings. And that survey research encountered so much opposition by the IRB. It took a series of meetings to explain why this was important, because they were concerned about the identifiability of the clinical staff who might say that they didn't have an obligation, or if they did. And I understand the concerns, but I also understood the need to gather these data, because if those data were actually out there, if those attitudes were there, it was something we needed to tackle. It was information we needed to find out. Now, we eventually did the study, and it was an interesting study, but the tension and the argument over the survey research was fascinating to me, as was the difficulty in doing research around ethical issues, which I've continued to do. So there must be something inherently wrong with me. They're going to be revising the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders, and I don't know if this disease will make it. But it's certainly a category of putting myself into a situation that's almost inevitably difficult when you're studying ethics. But a more meaningful experience, I think, was joining the IRB at Family Health International. The time we met quarterly, we were all unaffiliated with FHI, other than serving on the IRB. And my background and growing interest in research ethics really forced issues that pushed the bureaucracy in that setting in a way that I don't think expected at the time. It's probably better to ask other people, but they had open IRB meetings, and investigators would come to the meeting. So the IRB meeting would become an educational event for the organization. And the leadership of that organization wanted this to happen, even though it was changing the way that research was being done in the organization. So it was encouraging to get that kind of feedback, that it's okay if the investigator gets upset as long as we're getting the research right. I'm not sure, I hope we made a lot of good decisions. I'm sure we made some that weren't as good, but we sure struggled, and it was nice to watch that IRB mature over time and really address some of the toughest ethical issues in research that were faced around the time of the perinatal transmission trials of HIV. I think what was interesting during that time period was how to do review or meaningful review sitting in North Carolina for research being conducted around the globe. I had spent some time working as a physician in Tanzania, so anasema kidogo Kiswahili mama. I speak a little bit of Swahili, but that didn't mean that I understood more than that. But I was humbling enough to know that we needed an understanding of the local. So throughout our work, we kept trying to find ways or identify ways of bringing the local into the IRB that was located in the United States. And at times we brought in local experts. At other times we asked the investigators to provide information about context. We figured out what incentives were, and this many shillings was equivalent to how many haircuts or whatever the issue was, to try to get a sense of what matters locally, and that was critical for us. Over time, periodically, we would then begin to visit sites to go and see how well we were doing in terms of protecting the rights, interests, and welfare of participants in this research. So that's the sort of long view. The time of the perinatal transmission trials, especially in retrospect, was very interesting. There was a debate being fueled in the New England Journal of Medicine about the acceptability of use of placebo controls in a variety of trials after a U.S. trial showed great efficacy, the 076 trial, for using a very careful regimen that reduced maternal to child transmission down to 8%. That's stunning. Just the first great advance in preventing HIV infection was that study. And yet, it was completely infeasible at local levels for that research to take place. And investigators from around the globe, parts of Asia and Africa, were generating research protocols that were designed to address some of the issues. And the drug that was initially used was AZT, which we were learning was problematic for other reasons. So there was a need to test other drugs in other ways. And we reviewed some of the other agents as they were being proposed in these trials, and we had to say what was the effect of giving short-term use of antiretroviral agents to pregnant women in developing countries, and not knowing how well that would do both for the individual, to the woman, to the infant, to the community as a whole, and what would happen to viral resistance, if anything. We weren't familiar with those agents. And so really parsing that out, and in light of what we knew were very public debates about acceptability, probably were some of the toughest questions we faced. President Clinton did send a letter to Gary Ellis, who was the then head of OPRR, the Office of Protection of Research Risks, telling him to enforce the rules that were in place. And when Gary used to tell the story about this, it was he got a letter from the president to do his job, and boy, he went out and did it. And so what followed had both, I think, a positive and a negative effect on how we think about research ethics and regulation, was that many institutions were shut down. At least their research programs were shut down. And I was at one. I was at Duke, and we were about the fourth institution that was closed. What was very interesting was when that letter came from OPR to Duke, and the research enterprise needed to stop. I got a lot of emails that day. And email was just growing in its popularity, but I got more than I had ever received. I thought there was something wrong with the server, or something had gone wrong. And from the outside looking in, you say, well, Jeremy does all this research ethics nationally. What? Should I call him? Is he going to be looking for a job? Maybe I'll be a short order cook or something, because maybe I shouldn't call Jeremy today. Not a good day to call. But in fact, I hadn't been involved, and that was one of the problems we had at Duke, is that here I was developing a at least national and growing international reputation for my work in research ethics, but when the folks came in as a compliance matter to investigate what we were doing, I wasn't brought into the conversation. Well, once we were closed, I was sure brought into the conversation in a way that was rapid. We put together a task force. The Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs put together a task force, and it was a command performance. And that was very, very interesting and very difficult work to do. Because all of a sudden a task force had to then revamp and look at how research ethics was structured and educate the investigators and educate the IRBs and change an entire structure. It was clear when OPRR closed Duke that, similar to a tort signal, went around the country and people really paid attention. And there are many things that came out of that day that I think were important for research ethics and important for thinking about a career and thinking about how best to try to accomplish some of the work that we need to do in the human subjects protection field. On sort of a lighter note, people who called at the time were from various places, and we were sort of just after March Madness, I believe, when this happened, and Dan Nelson, who was working at UNC, which, for posterity is probably going to know that Caroline and Duke just don't get along during basketball season. But Dan was nice enough to call anyway, and he called and he said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "How do I feel?" He said, "Yeah, how do you feel?" I said, "How do I feel? I feel like Harvey Keitel." He said, "You feel like Harvey Keitel? What's the matter with you?" He said, "Why do you feel like Harvey Keitel?" I said, "It's like in Pulp Fiction." I said, "There was this murder, and the kid's in the back of the car and a corpse on his car, and I feel like I'm the cleaner. Because I couldn't clean it up, but I could tell people how they might clean it up, because I wasn't the morally responsible person for doing it. The institutional officials were." And we ended up working very hard with the task force of mostly people who are much older than me in that room most of the time. And interns don't look good in their 20s when they stay up for a few days in a row. And deans and chairmen look even worse. And we went and met with OPRR a few days later, and the suspension was lifted with the need to conduct an educational program and to radically support the IRB. And I became deeply involved in that effort, and it was sort of my worst nightmare, was I was told I had to be the guy to give the ethics talk that everyone needed to attend before they could do research again. Now that's not a job you want. Giving the fire extinguisher talk or the sexual harassment talk or any kind of required compliance training is like the worst job possible, because no one likes to go to required trainings for anything. Now, is it important that we know how to use fire extinguishers? Absolutely. No sexual harassment? Absolutely. Research ethics? Absolutely. But the person giving the talk, not a great job. The dean came to every one of the talks and explained that I was just the messenger and that the shots needed to be fired to the institution. And when the institution stepped up and realized that, it was a change in culture that was fascinating to observe and even more important for how things changed. I gave that talk I don't know how many times. It's the same talk that is now the bulk of the training programs from around the country and in parts of the world about the basic history and ethics of human subjects research. We did it live. It was the time before web-based modules and the like, but a really interesting event. And what I learned in that moment was that we rushed to evaluate it. I was so worried that people were going to hate it. We didn't think to pull out the standard meeting evaluation form, just borrowing the items. We invented our own, and we forgot to put in, what did you like best? People filled that thing out, and the free-flowing comments that we read were amazing, because they said, I never had this before. I didn't know that history. that makes sense to think about ethical principles in research. And what you realize is that the people who are conducting research, most of them anyway, are smart and well-intentioned, but they hadn't been trained in the ethics of human subjects research. Similarly, IRB members weren't trained in the same way. They were given chapter and verse and told to interpret it themselves. And it wasn't necessarily pretty. But once they understood the rationale, things changed, and things changed for the better. People would actually solicit advice about trial design and informed consent and a variety of issues. And so that piece was, I think, really important to understand and remember that most of the folks in this business, if you will, are in it for the right reasons. So I think part of it was first making sure that it mattered, making this morally salient, and providing institutional support to make a research protection program possible. At the time Duke was closed, there were hundreds and hundreds of protocols. There were 2 people who were barely able to keep up with staffing the IRB. There was 1 IRB. There wasn't sufficient attention or time put on the project. And so coming from the top, it really is the culture of the institution, providing adequate resources to let them do their research and appealing to their brains and their wisdom. And so I think that's what would ride through it. The particulars are probably no longer as relevant as they were at the time, and but I think that's the sort of common feature that's the thread through time. Gradually, the number of IRBs grew, the capacity to do review changed, the electronic infrastructure. It wasn't run out of little note cards anymore. They used things called computers to facilitate review. They changed administrators. I mean, just a variety of approaches. There was a continuing ethics education program that we built, so we did build some of the first web-based modules on human subjects research. They were expensive to do, but they built on the sort of live lectures we were doing, and we built in from the beginning the idea that people needed to frequently take modules, that it wasn't, or some kind of educational event, that it wasn't one lecture that was going to sustain attention to these issues. And so they followed through with a lot of their changes over time, and we brought in people to help with that process as well. The standard story is that of experiments gone bad. Historically, the Nazi experiments, and then explaining to investigators why that would matter, and the promulgation of the Nuremberg Code. And even though we don't think people are Nazis, why it was important to understand the beginning of careful articulation of international standards. Going to the Declaration of Helsinki, and how the World Medical Association by the 1960s realized that we didn't need a code for Nazis, we needed a code for doctors. And describing the differences and some of the debates around that. And then uncovering the history of the U.S. at the time. We were not clear. We had a series of experiments that raised ethical concerns that were openly published in the literature, revealed by many people, including Beecher in his landmark article. This is all going on while the U.S. Public Health Service's study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, also called the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, was going on and being published without recognition of why it was wrong. And rather than detail all of the problematic aspects, which is in itself could take days of talking, how the current system we have then evolved from the revelation of the Tuskegee, the experiments at Tuskegee, or the study at Tuskegee, followed by one commission meeting, and then the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. They're issuing a discussion about the Belmont Report and what philosophical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, and how those come out, and then show how those map to the regulations. So that's the standard brief version. Yeah, I don't think there's one size fits all. I think it's exquisitely clear that the science has to be good, and it has to be reviewed. and to not assure that there's adequate review wherever it happens. And I don't really care much about the debate about who does it and when, as long as it's done. And there are some things that are going to be within the capability of an IRB to review and others that frankly are not. But it needs scientific review. Good ethics starts with good science. And so ensuring that, that's the main important piece. And that's what I think I've learned over time. I have done a lot of work globally trying to build IRB capacity or investigator capacity with research ethics. And so the sort of lessons of how to teach research ethics at every level, from undergraduates to medical students to graduate student courses to practicing investigators to IRBs that are existing or IRBs are growing, to some of the work with PRIM&R, and a little bit with IRB 101 and IRB 250 and a variety of ways of trying to train people in different ways. So that is a sort of, in aggregate, a whole lot of IRBs and have engaged in a variety of activities with them. My own work outside of that has focused on a variety of questions related to research ethics. With Jeff Kahn and Anna Mastriani, we put together a book on justice in research called Beyond Consent, where we looked at this sort of changing paradigm of research, where we built research protections at a time when protections were needed, and justice in research was taking care of the least well-off, consonant with the theorists of the time, like John Rawls, that our mission and role was to protect all the people who had been, if you will, screwed over in the process, and to make sure that wouldn't happen. And if you look at our regs, they're very much structured that way. But we also saw first through AIDS activism and then cancer activism and then other disease-based activism, a desire for access to experimental therapies. So that change, what does that mean? And the book focuses on that in a variety of settings. Some conceptual project. Done a variety of studies taking that simple descriptive project from the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to carry out a research program to pursue the question of, is it possible to measure and improve the quality of informed consent in clinical research? And so probably the culmination of that work was first developing a tool we call the BICEP, the Brief Informed Consent Evaluation Protocol, in which people who have just given informed consent call a phone bank and they conduct this interview to evaluate the quality of informed consent. And we fielded the BICEP in a trial, a site randomized trial, to see if by making informed consent important to research nurses and research coordinators, could we improve the process? And it's about 1,000 patient participants in trials at about 50 sites across the country, and the system failed, but we were able to do the study. And as Phil Lavoie, my great collaborator on this, he called me on the phone and said, I got the results. And he said, are you sitting down? I said, oh no, after years and years of work, what are you saying? He goes, are you sitting down? And I said, yeah. He said, it didn't work. And he said, but it's not chopped liver. I said, well, what do you mean it's not chopped liver? And he said, not chopped liver, because you fielded a trial with the same rigor as any national multi-center trial to test anything was, with the same degree of rigor, and you've tested it and you've shown a great idea didn't work. And that great idea could have easily been adopted into policy and cost people time and money and just gotten in the way. And that's the importance of, it's not a negative result, it's an informative result. And that story is really good because it's very humbling to see it. Well, we're thinking about ways to adapt the BICEP so it can be used for quality assurance of informed consent and thinking about other interventions, but that was a really good and fun project to work on. Related to that was a series of projects over 5 years in collaboration primarily with Kevin Weinfurt, who's at Duke, and Mark Hall at Wake Forest, and we brought along a whole bunch of other teams. We had an extraordinary team without which we couldn't have done any of this. We called COINS, the Conflict of Interest Notification Study, because it occurred to us that every policy about the disclosure of financial interests in research called for disclosure of these financial interests, but it was unclear to us who should disclose it, why you're disclosing it, how you should disclose it, and what effects it would have on the research enterprise and the potential research participants. And so through a series of research projects, we explored this question, figuring out that there were some disconnects, some paradoxical findings of disclosure that should inform policies, and a disconnect between policy and practice. And some other research went towards figuring out what kind of protections are in place in internationally collaborative research, and that was work done as a consultant to the commission that followed the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, and it was the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, and some of our findings there crept into their policy recommendations with respect to respecting the perspectives and the ways that other peoples have of protecting their own interest. And then most recently, serving as a senior advisor to the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues on looking at what the range of research projects that are going on now are informative. I'm trying to think. One other really fun area over time was some early work that I did at Duke in collaboration with Joanne Kurtzberg, who was involved with the first umbilical cord blood transplant. And soon after I got back to Duke, Joanne came to my office and said, well, I hear you're the ethics guy, and I got some ethics issues I want to discuss. And she was talking about the early banking of cord blood to create the first cord blood banks. Now, if you do the math on that, that was about 1993 or 4 we got together. And it was unusual because they had done this first cord blood transplant, and it was very successful for a little boy who had Fanconi's anemia, who is still alive today as a result of this first cord blood transplant. And cord blood transplantation now is so much a part of our standard practice, it's hard to imagine that it's happened so fast. But there were some real questions about banking cord blood. And it was some people's waste, but for other people it's deeply symbolic. So what did it mean to collect information, or collect cord blood, first of all, and then to quarantine the cord blood so that you could test it for diseases that transmit the same way that babies are made, and so for HIV and genetic disorders. And then what do you do with the information? Do you feed it back if there are things that are wrong with the cord blood? Do you feed it back? Will the child be raised differently and the like? What was the proper timing of consent for cord blood? When I first got into the field, people were trying to obtain consent in labor. I really didn't think that that was a hard question. Having spent a year as an intern in obstetrics, I knew that labor was not a great time to engage in meaningful conversation, but you'd think that that was obvious to folks, but we actually had to pull some data from another study to show the scientists that that just wasn't good. And we mapped this change, and Joanne and Emily Reisner and I wrote a paper about some of the basic issues as a thought paper to JAMA. And in an unusual moment, we heard back about 3 weeks after sending the manuscript in, which at the time was not heard of, and they asked for about 250 more words. I've never been invited since to spend more words. You might even stop asking more questions because I've said so many words, but I've never invited to say more. And that got a lot of attention, but we then put together a working group to bring in additional perspectives. And then we realized we needed to gather data to see if we were right. And so we did telephone surveys of women who had donated cord blood and the like. The wonderful thing about cord blood was my mother was asking me what I worked on. But my mother and my sister both asked me about this project. And my mother asked me, what's the big deal? It's just thrown out. And I told her about some of the cultural traditions about cord placentas and how they differ globally and how they're a rich set of traditions, which is, we probably don't need to spend too much time there, but very, very rich traditions. And I explained about the quarantine, I explained about consent and about whether you had a duty to notify. And my mother says, oh dear, today. She goes, I understand it. She said, I have another question. She said, did they pay you to be a pain in the ass? And I said, yes, but not enough. The other interesting piece is my sister was pregnant at the time, and there was a rise of private cord blood companies coming up. And she said, well, she's a social worker, and so she always does a careful intake when she talks to me. How are you? How's the house? You know, how's work? You know, you're finding time to have fun. And I just got to the how's the work kind of question, and she said, I mentioned cord blood. She goes, you know, I just got a brochure about that. And I said, yeah? She said, it told me I should bank my baby's cord blood. And it, you know, costs a couple $1,000s a year. And I said, so what'd you do with it? She said, well, I threw it out. Then I got really worried about it, and I worried if I was being a decent mom and whether I had done the right thing. And just that very close perspective on what that simple brochure might mean about creating the healthy baby and what it meant. And I have to say, both my nephews are very healthy, but that was an interesting perspective on that problem. And so again, over a period of probably 15 years, we've looked at this issue of cord blood and tweaked and changed the process in response to a changing understanding of the disease. So that's just some of the examples of some of the work.
What do you think it takes to create a culturally competent investigator and a culturally competent research staff?
You know, I don't know what it takes. I know it's a need. And I think telling a variety of stories, opening people's eyes and their ears to what's going on in them is an important first step. Because you can't, again, prepare everybody for every cultural moment they're going to encounter. And I think early on when I was doing some international research ethics, I was told to remember that the local people are the experts. And I think if you can remember that the local people are the experts, that's probably a good way to go about it. PRIM&R meetings, I don't know what the upsurge was, the precise numbers, but I think when I was invited, I was told that there'd be a few hundred people in the room. And when I arrived fresh from a DSMB meeting in Paris into Boston for that meeting, I walked into the room in Boston and there were well over 1,000 people and there was an overfill. And I don't tend to write my talks, as you know, but I did have slides. For a group over 1,000, especially after flying back from a meeting in Paris, I might have written my talk. And I showed that film clip from Pulp Fiction. And I remember telling the audiovisual guy, because at the time it was videotape, that he had to start it at this moment. That was easy. But he had to hit the stop button at exactly the point where they say, besides how it looks, the car is cool, because it degrades, and the language degrades in such a way that I didn't want to explain to my over 1,000 new best friends about why I was showing an R-rated movie at a PRIM&R meeting, where usually it's more love and peace than R-rated movies. So he got into watching the film and let it go on a little long. And I remember going around that day and giving a fairly strong talk about what had happened and what was important. And many people who were there, either first-time attendees or repeat offenders, all came by and said, this is great. And one woman at the reception looked at me and she said, that was the most tasteless thing I have ever seen. I said, thank you. But, so, I didn't do a systematic sampling, but it was a really interesting introduction to PRIM&R. And once you guys got your hooks in me, I wasn't allowed to go.
Curious about whether an apology was ever offered to the victims and or their families of the radiation experiments. I know one was offered by President Clinton with the assistance of Marion Gray Secundi to the Tuskegee survivors and their descendants. I know one was offered by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to the survivors and their descendants of the Guatemalan studies. And I never heard about anything with respect to the radiation survivors, and it may well be my memory lapse, or it may be that none materialized.
Sure. So the committee debated about an apology at length because there are implications when the government apologizes about what it might be responsible to do in response to the apology. And the committee was leaning on the side, I believe, of the apology, but it didn't much matter. When President Clinton came in, we delivered the final report to him. Ruth Faden handed it over, and there were some of the victims of these radiation experiments in the first rows. And President Clinton looked around and he said, "For what the U.S. government did, I am sorry." And I remember Reed Tuckson, I was sitting next to him, and he was one of the commission members. He's sitting next to me, he goes, "We debated for that long, and he made it look so easy," because it was important. So there was an apology. And that was important. When I was at Hopkins the first time as a fellow, one of the jobs that I had was to be an examining physician. So part of the member of the research staff for the MACS, Multicenter AIDS Cohort Study, which was a natural history study of men who had sex with men in several cities across the United States. The MACS is still going on. And at the time, it was essential to have the strictest confidentiality measures possible because the participants were at great risk of stigma and criminal activity in some of the states in which they lived, and a variety of concerns. And in order to map the natural history of HIV infection, it was critical to do this study. And what was great about that, serving that role as an examining physician, is each participant only had a number. They had their names, but not to be shared. And there was a separate person who made appointments. There was a separate person who did interviews. There was a separate person who did the exam, and a separate person who obtained lab results. And after this very prescribed physical exam, which is atypical, if I'm doing examinations on patients, I'm talking all the time, but it was really supposed to be as objective as you could be. You could then talk to people about what questions they might have and what was going on. And I remember walking in one day and I said, "Are you, 79625?" And that's not the real number, just in case you are 79625 who's listening. And the participant said to me, "What's your number?" And all I could think about was 24601. I had to be Jean Valjean. And he got it and he laughed. And he had a long conversation about how meaningful it was to participate in research, to do this, even though he had a very important job in a city not so far from Baltimore. And he was a very public figure who felt that this was critical, and realizing the sort of meaning that people attributed. So that was one. And then years later, when I was serving on the IRB at FHI, we did a site visit where we had approved a very truncated informed consent procedure for a very important study regarding vaginal microbicides. And the procedure was truncated in the sense that all the required information was there, but we used pictures and we used dice to explain the randomization. We were a little nervous about having a 15-page consent document, but only 3 sentences per page with pictures as satisfying the requirements, but it did meet all the requirements. But Dave Baraski and I went to some of the study sites and interviewed people who were participants in the research. And talking with a couple of the women who were enrolled in this trial about the use of vaginal microbicide and what they meant and how they understood it. And they really got it and they retained it. And that was just great to know that these things worked. That was good. That reminds me, I didn't answer your question about what's happened at Hopkins or since the move. And I was really privileged to get a phone call from folks at Hopkins asking me if I would move there during 2003, and I began there in 2004. I had to go up and interview them. I felt like I didn't have to interview for the job. It just sort of offered it to me, and I said, "Well, do you mind if I come up and interview you?" And it was great to meet the people there again after I'd been away for almost 10 years at the time, and have the ability to come back to a great institution that was also going through some of its own struggles at the time with respect to research ethics. And it has been just an honor to work with people there who care so deeply about their science, and all my colleagues in ethics as well, because it's opened up possibilities. By having an endowed chair at Hopkins, it made it possible for me to take on some risky research efforts and the like. Soon after I arrived, I was contacted by some folks in Uganda who were having some questions about perinatal transmission trials. And I think if I'd been at Duke and someone, it was going to take a week to just said, if you send me a plane ticket, I'll come over and help with the ethical questions. And I was fine doing that. I had enough buffer to be able to do that. And that reminded me of the importance of some of the HIV work, which I hadn't done in a decade while I had been at Duke, other than the FHI piece. So that got me involved in that, and got involved with the HIV Prevention Trials Network, and now chair their ethics working group, where we've issued guidance document that we hope is helpful to people. The Conflict of Interest Project took place at Hopkins, even in collaboration with the folks at Duke, but it's just such a rich environment to be able to bounce these crazy ideas off of people to try to get it right. I think sometimes the word subjects is correct. I'm with Charlie McCarthy on that issue, but it's not always correct. I think engaged research, certain types of research in which people are participating actively, they're participating. Another job I have now is I'm the ethics officer for the Resuscitation's Outcome Consortium, where we're doing studies using an exemption from the requirement of informed consent. And these are really tough situations. We desperately need data to improve the ways we resuscitate people who suffer cardiac arrest, people who have traumatic injuries, shock, traumatic brain injury, and the like. And it doesn't seem to make sense to call them participants in so much of a way. But it's critically important research, and we can't do it with consent. We have to really be careful as we're skating on that ice, that the ice is thick enough to get this research done without affecting their welfare. But they're subjects. And so I think it's important to think through that issue and use it as appropriately. I might have messed it up too. So I think the recent excitement in HIV and AIDS research in the last couple of years, the advancements there, call for us to examine some interesting questions in research design. I think that's going to be really critical to get the ethics of the research design right, and that's also important for some work we're just starting out with the NIH Collaboratory, which is looking at doing pragmatic clinical trials, comparative effectiveness research, how best to do that, things that fall outside of the scope of what we've done, or at least how we've done it. This is going to be a nice set of challenges there as well. I think those areas are going to definitely require a lot of effort. Jeff and Anna and I are re-looking at the Justice book, and so that'll be a project we're taking on. So those are the couple of the things I'll be doing now, and also trying to figure out this overlap of human rights and ethics, and when we find ourselves working in environments in which there are human rights issues, to say it mildly, about what the appropriate role ought to be for those of us engaged in that research. So I think that'll keep me busy for at least a little while.